Welcome, everyone. Good to have you here. Great to see some faces I didn't recognize right off, or faces from other contexts. And so you may not even, some of you might not know who I am. I'm Tom Waltice. I'm the director of Geneva, and I thank you for coming. This is the 94th Geneva lecture that started way back in 1976, usually two, one per each semester, but sometimes we've done additional ones as well. We want to thank you for coming. We want to thank the University of Iowa for the use of this space as well. That functions very well for us. We do apologize to some of you that they have taken away the parking out front. You know, parking in Iowa City is a high premium as well. So sorry for a few of you had to walk a little farther than expected, but there's not much we can do about that, especially in Iowa City as well. So Geneva's tagline is that we are a Christian exploration at the University of Iowa. By that we mean we help students explore Christianity and explore the meaning of their faith for their sense of engagement of the world, for their studies, for their learning, for their life. And so we do these lecture series also to continue to explore that element of societal issues that are happening and how the Christian faith might interact and engage with them. So we celebrate that the Christian faith calls us to be engaged in all areas of life, and also today, as we'll explore, in the political arena. So we have with us Dr. Carrie Covington, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa, to speak on understanding and responding to our polarized politics, a Christian perspective. Dr. Covington is not new to this area in any way, not new to Iowa, obviously, although they have somewhat started to move away, but not new to this area of exploration in politics. He has studied the institution of the presidency and how it keeps changing, the changing nature of the president's relationship with Congress and the legislative process. He is currently doing what he will share with us in his research, exploring the issue of polarization, the changes taking place in the American political attitude, and the role of religion in addressing this area in politics as well. Dr. Covington has been working for many years in this area, as I said, way back, I believe, I'm not sure exactly the date, but I think it was 1974. He was serving as an intern for a congressman that was a strong supporter for President Nixon as it was going to whether Nixon was going to be impeached or not. And when that representative changed his position to no longer support Nixon, the next day Nixon resigned. So Dr. Covington has been involved in this since at least 1974 in very direct ways as well. Back in 1985, Jason Chen, the first director of Geneva, recruited Carrie to help interact with students and faculty. When Geneva became an independent tax organization, I forget what you call it, nonprofit, 501(c), back in around 1998, and had to form a board. Carrie was one of the first board members, and then soon after that became chair of the board for about 15 years. And so we appreciate his service to Geneva over the years, and we wanted to have him be our lecturer also to honor him in his service in that way. But you came probably largely to kind of explore the difficult questions that we are facing, as there seems to be polarization for sure. The question is it growing? Is it new? Why are we paying more attention to it now? Is it something that is changing? And how should religious communities, and especially in this context, a Christian community, interact with this issue and address it and respond to it in ways that we hope Dr. Carrington will lead us in? So we thank you for coming, but most of all, we also thank Professor Covington for being with us. And Carrie, if you would please come up. Thank you.
Okay, well, I thank Tom for that introduction, a generous introduction. I want to tell you it is an honor to be selected to be a Geneva lecture speaker. In addition to the many speakers you've seen identified on the screen, I was here when people like Ron Sider and Jim Wallace and Cornel West and John Perkins, Richard Mao, a whole host of really deep thinking Christians who talk about how their life intersects, their Christian faith intersects their life. And so to follow in their footsteps is both an honor and it's also a little weighty. So I really appreciate it. So when Tom approached me about doing this talk, I suggested this topic. And I suggested this topic because it's one that started to weigh on my mind in the lead up to the 2016 presidential elections. I was a little nervous about talking about it because, you know, when I was growing up, my mom always told me that in a polite conversation, things you shouldn't talk about politics or religion. And so I was nervous, but then I realized I'm talking about politics and religion, so it's probably okay, right? If one's negative and the other's negative, put them together, it's positive. Let me put my slides up because the next thing I want to say has to do with the title. And you'll see it says A Christian Perspective. And so that's really important to me, that this is my take. This is the way I've come to think about things over the course of my Christian faith and my life as a political scientist and how those two things sort of merge together. But I know it's what I think and what I know isn't complete, isn't always necessarily correct. And so while I appreciate your questions for more information, I also appreciate your comments reacting to the ideas that I suggest and things you like about it or things you think maybe I should tweak. And as Tom suggested, at the Q&A, at the reception at the church, there will be a time for that as well. And that we could follow up there as well if that's what you'd like to do. This is really a fraught time to be talking about this topic. We're at the beginning, as you all know, of a process to consider whether or not to impeach a president. And man, that's like the most deep kind of question for a democratic society like ours to take on, because the president's been elected and we're talking about taking him out of office. You know your history, you know it's only happened a few other times, 3 other times, but it's a very important time to have this kind of a conversation, I think. There are people who already know in their hearts that we have enough evidence to remove Donald Trump from office. Why don't we just get on with it? There are other people who are firmly convinced that this is just a conspiracy. This is the Democrats with their Trump derangement syndrome. They've never been able to accept that he won the election, and so now they're using the deep state to take him out of office. And we have these two groups in our society, side by side, trying to work forward, how do we do politics in the United States? There's no doubt that this time is as polarized a time in our history as any of us are aware of. I'm going to show you some signs to tell you we've had polarization in the past as well, but this is about as bad a situation of polarization as we've had. And as Tom was telling you, I worked in Washington for a summer. I was just an intern. But it was actually the summer of '72. So it was the summer when Watergate happened. I was in a dorm just down the street from the Watergate Tower when the Watergate break-in happened. And the willingness of people to accept the good intentions of people on the other side in 1972 are not present today. I mean, there were members of Congress who cast aspersions on particularly the Democrats' reasons for wanting to impeach Nixon. But the member of Congress I worked for, he was as diehard a conservative as you could find. He was kind of stunned that his staff picked this guy with a fuzzy hair to be an intern for him. But he earned my respect because he took the Democrats seriously. He wanted to look at the evidence, and when he got the evidence he needed, he agreed that it was time to ask the president to leave or remove him if he wouldn't. In 1998, I was a parent trying to explain to my children why everybody was mad at Bill Clinton. And why do they want to impeach him, Dad? Well, he lied. What did he lie about, Dad? Ask your mother. But even that, I mean, as a full-grown adult at that point, the level and intensity of animosity in 97, 98 doesn't feel to me to be like what it is today. People are so set in the ways they're thinking. And I think that's part of this polarization that's been taking place. So that brings me to today's talk. And from the title, I want to show you where the three pieces of it are going to come from. One is polarized politics. What do we mean by polarized politics? That's when I'll be talking to you as a political scientist, okay? So I've garnered evidence and got ideas about that, and I'll talk to you about that as a political scientist. But then I also want to talk about how we should understand polarization and how we should respond to polarization from a Christian perspective. And then I'm just talking like any of you would about your faith, if you're a Christian, from whatever faith tradition you have. How do you feel you should react to this? So the first set of things I'm going to talk about are pretty statistical, firm, and we know what they mean. The second and third ones, I invite you to think about what you agree with, what you disagree with, and share with us, share with me the reactions you have, because I'm firmly convinced that none of us have the answers, and the way we get the answers is by talking to people we disagree with. So with that in mind, let's start with the first topic. The first topic is, what do we mean by political polarization? One of the really beneficial things of giving a talk like this is you study the topic more deeply than you do otherwise, because you have to get up in front of people and talk to them about it, so you better know what you're talking about. And so as I explored this idea over the last couple of months, getting ready for this presentation, I developed a more systematic understanding of the dynamics of what we mean by political polarization. So I want to talk about political polarization in three dimensions or three facets. The first is the idea of ideological or policy-based polarization. This is the thing that usually comes to mind when people, oh, the Democrats are getting more liberal, the Republicans are getting more conservative, and that's all true. But it's based on policy. And so we usually think of this kind of disagreement as rational. Is it better to raise taxes or is it better to lower taxes? Should we have medical care for everyone or should we not have medical care for everyone? It's you're using your brain to think of these things. You're pulling facts to support your positions. In the United States, particularly, this idea of polarization on liberal and conservative dimensions is a little what's the word I want to use here? It's a little confusing to political scientists because liberals and conservatives aren't really ideological. Liberals in the United States tend to support government intervention when we have economic questions, regulation of the environment, regulation of product safety, all kinds of those sorts of things, taxation. But they want very little government involvement in people's social lives. We don't want the government telling us what to believe or what to think. Don't tell a woman what to do with their body. Don't tell children whether or how to pray in school. They want the government's hands off in social policy, and conservatives tend to mirror that. The less government you have in the economy, the better the economy will do, so let's cut taxes, let's roll back regulations, and let the economy boom, let the entrepreneurs take us to new heights. But we need a socially ordered society. We need to reflect the good values we've always had, and therefore we need the government to come in and support things like, and you still hear this today, not so much, but prayer in school. When the Supreme Court ruled prayer in school unconstitutional, organized prayer in school, anybody can pray before a test if they want. But when they ruled out organized school or prayer in school in the 1960s, more than 2/3 of the American people thought that was a bad idea, and it continued at those numbers up into the mid-70s. And today the numbers have dropped off, right? And the issues with same-sex marriage, you have the same kind of idea. We need to embrace our traditional values. This is a disruption of that, and so we want the government to step in and fix it, make sure it's okay. And so it's kind of a conundrum that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, favor government involvement in different venues. But when we accept that to be the case, and we look to see, does this ideological polarization occur, we can see it, okay? And so this is a graph, and it's got a lot of information on it. I'll walk through it really quickly. But it parses out the American public into different groups, starting with everybody. Anybody who ever could answer a poll is in the top line. People who answer questions that say, yeah, I vote and I give money to candidates, or I talk to my friends about elections, they're on the second line. The third line is anybody who says, I'm a Democrat or a Republican. Today, about 60% of the American people associate themselves with the parties, those two major parties. It used to be much higher, and that's a talk for a different day. But you're talking 65% of the people will identify themselves as a Democrat or a Republican. And the bottom line are those people who are Democrats and Republicans and are engaged in politics. People like you probably are going to go to the caucuses and going to participate, going to vote. You're going to vote in your city council and school board elections. Those are the engaged partisans. And what you see is, and this is a relatively short period of time when we're talking about American history, and it's bound by when did we start polling, right? When did we start asking these questions? And so this is the Pew Foundation. And they're a very reputable organization that supports a lot of research, and they started asking these questions in 1994, and so that's why we're starting there. If I had my druthers, they'd have started back in the 30s, but they weren't even there, I don't think. So what they show us is that in 1994, now think about 1994, those of you who are old enough, this is the year of the Republican Revolution overthrowing Democratic control of the Congress. 1994, the Republicans take control of the Congress for the first time since 1950. Remember that, it was kind of a very impressive event. You know the guy John Kasich, right? Everybody knows John Kasich. You know, our attitude towards John Kasich, oh, he's the reasonable Republican. He's the one who talks nice about Democrats and Republicans. In 1994, he was a hair-on-fire, Newt Gingrich, radical rebel going to burn down the government. But where he was then, today, is something that we find more reasonable, right? We've changed. So back in 1994, you see what we always say the American public looks like. It's a hill-shaped curve, and there's a few liberals, a few conservatives, and everybody else is in the middle. And as you move towards 2017, you see it begins to flatten out, right? It's basically flat now, and then it drops off in the on the conservative end. But who knows? 2019, when they bring out those results, we may get some more shuffling. But the main thing to see is it's flattening out. The middle isn't the dominant piece anymore. And when you get to engaged public people, you see that it's about 3 or 4 years ahead of the curve of the general public, and all the way down to 2017, you can actually begin to see the U-shaped curve that we associate with polarization. Polarization meaning more people move to the left and the right, and it sort of begins to empty out the middle. And the general public is beginning to show that kind of a pattern. When you get to the parties, it becomes much more apparent. In the 1994, 2004, it looks like you expect, right? It looks hardly any different than 2004 for the general public. But then beginning after 2014, beginning in 2014, you begin to see the parties really pull apart. And by 2017, anybody who's a Democrat and Republican, the middle is emptying out. And when you get to party identifiers who are engaged, that is us, the people who participate on a regular basis, you see what's happened by 2017. Hardly anybody in the middle, everybody's gone to their corner on the left and the right, and we're ready to fight it out. So that is ideological polarization. This is based, the question might come up, how do they decide where to put people on this line? They have a bunch of questions they ask people that have been validated through polling to help identify people's ideological position. So the way we think of it is people on the left are consistently choosing the liberal position, people on the right are consistently choosing the conservative position, and people in the middle sort of go left and go right on different questions. So are they moderate? That's not exactly what that means, but they're mixed is the word that Pew means. But you see in '94, that those set of questions produce what we expect. So I think it measures what we think it should measure. And by 2017, when we're talking about Democrats and Republicans, the people who actually do the work of government and elections, we're highly polarized. So that's one kind of polarization. The second kind of polarization we call affective polarization. And that means you begin to attach normative value to your group as opposed to their group. I don't just disagree with them, but I'm good and they're bad. I'm right and they're wrong, and there's something wrong with them for being wrong. And so you begin to see negative and positive sentiments being attached to the groups. And actually, this question, this kind of a question, has been studied on issues other than politics, right? If you want to know about race relations, if you want to know about religion, you ask people, how do you feel about people like yourself? How do you feel about people different from you? And that it begins to get at the idea of an affective polarization. Now, sometimes we train our children to be affectively polarized. You should be a patriot. You should stand when we sing the Pledge of Allegiance and so on, right? We're the best country. We're better than the other countries. You know, when I was a little kid, it really made me proud that other countries would bend their flag when they marched by the UN flag or by the Olympic flag at the the 4-year Olympics. Every other country, when they'd have their flag upright, and when they pass the Olympic flag, they lower it as a sign of respect. The Americans, we never lower our flag for anybody. We're proud of us, we like who we are, and we're not bowing to you. And especially when I was a kid, I thought that was pretty cool. I don't know that I think that anymore, but it shows you we're teaching our children affective socialization, polarization that we endorse. But we also deal with affective polarization that we condemn, things like racism or religious bigotry and so on. And so I want to show you that these things do indeed change over time. So here, this is a study that compiled all these other studies to sort of show what's going on. And you can't read the numbers, but this goes all the way back to 1964 and takes us up to 2008. So realize 2008, that's before anything I've shown you data for so far or will show you data for coming up. 2008 is sort of like the good old days when everybody more or less got along compared to today. And what you see is on the vertical axis is what we call thermometer feelings. And so you say, how warmly do you feel towards people in your group? And you give it a 80, 90, 100% rating. How positively, how warmly do you feel about people from other groups? Oh, 30 or 40%. Well, that would be a big gap, right? And so you see that the feelings thermometer gap on race was up around 25% back in 1964. I was alive in '64. I remember civil rights movement. I remember seeing on the evening news fire hoses turned on African American citizens. I remember the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. That's where this is. And here you see religious differences, Catholic and Protestant, and you see that there's a pretty big difference there, that Protestants feel good about themselves but not so good about Catholics. And remember, just a few years earlier, 4 years earlier, we had a big debate about whether we could even elect a president who was Catholic, John Kennedy. And both of those have smoothed out and moved down. And it doesn't mean there's not racism anymore. That's not what that's saying. But it's saying when people think about different groups, they're more likely to evaluate them normatively similar to themselves. And that's in principle, that's not in practice, right? And I like to think that that's sort of the victory of political correctness. We don't say bad things about people anymore based on race or disability or gender or what have you. But what you'll see is that party affiliation follows a very different course. It starts off going down just like the others, and then they and then it starts going up, right? And so the reason there's two different lines is because the question being used changed a little bit. It went from Democrat Republican to Democratic Party Republican Party. And so to let everybody know, keep it above table, they drew two different lines. But you'll see it begins going up for the original line, and then it keeps going up. And so now it's higher than anybody's ever was, and that's in 2008. And what that means is, I'm a Democrat, I feel good about my party, and I feel coldly towards the Republican Party. Okay? So that's affective. Now, let's explore the idea of that affective polarization in the parties. And now we're going to pull back the cover of warm and cold and say, what goes into that warm and cold feeling? Okay? And we can thank the Pew people for this. And I'm going to throw a lot of numbers and pictures and graphs at you, but I'm going to try to highlight what I want you to see as sort of the trend. So on the left, you see, how do I feel about my own party? And it only goes from 2016 to 2019, but you can see Democrats are feeling much more positive about their party by 2019 than they were in December of 2016. And the same thing is true for the Republicans from March of 16 to September of 19. They're up substantially. And by the same token, the way Democrats feel about Republicans is very negative, from 61 down to 79, from 69 down to 83. And so we're getting more, we're feeling more warm towards our guys and more cold towards the other guys. So, here. This is what stopped me cold in 4 years ago this month. This graph stopped me cold, and there's others that go with it. And it says, what do you think about people in the other party? How are they compared to the average American? 52% of Republicans think Democrats are closed-minded. This is in 2016. This is before the election. This is before Trump has been nominated. Okay? Trump gets the nomination in June or July. This is April, May, March, April, May. 70% of Democrats think Republicans are closed-minded. Well, that's okay. I mean, we're likely to think that way. You're not listening to me. I'm not persuading you that you must be closed-minded. But look at the next number. 47% of Republicans think Democrats are immoral. 35% of Democrats think Republicans are immoral. Well, that's bad enough. Now fast forward 3 years, and now 2/3 of Republicans think Democrats are closed-minded. 3/4 of Democrats think Republicans are closed-minded. More than half of Republicans, this is not the engaged Republicans, this is every Republican. More than half of the Republicans think Democrats are immoral. Are you going to work with someone who's immoral? Are you going to try to change policy if the people you're working with think you think they're immoral? Almost half of Democrats think Republicans are immoral. And you get other categories here. You can see dishonest, and that drops out, and lazy, and you can see the numbers, and so they're smaller. But the idea of being closed-minded and immoral is giving you a sense of why people feel so negatively towards everybody else. I'm trying to see where I click now. Let's go here. Now this is the graph. This is actually the graph that stopped me cold, the one on the right. And this is the idea of, do you feel favorable or unfavorable to the other party? And the graph on the left shows you kind of what we've been talking about, but look at the graph on the right, the chart on the right. And this is 2014, 2016. I did my best to find this question in Pew for 2018, 2019. I couldn't find it. I feel like these numbers scared Pew so much they don't even want to know. That's what I think. They don't even want to know the answer to this question. But the question is, do you think the other party is a threat to the nation's well-being? Are they actively undermining our country? 45% of Republicans said yes, and 41% of Democrats said yes. No wonder we don't like each other. We're reading each other's motives as trying to harm our country. All that patriotism stuff is feeding in and saying they have to be bad because they're trying to undo our country. Okay, so that is effective, and that gives you a sense of what's happening. So sociologists political scientists, journalists begin to use a word that to me is a little problematic. We call it tribalism. And if you know our history of talking about tribes and Indians and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of not a very acceptable phrase to me, but it's the term of art that people use. And so tribalism is used to say, you're a part of your group no matter what. Okay, Stephen Decatur said back in the 1800s, my country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, my country. And that's tribalism. That's saying there's nothing you can do to say there's something wrong with this. And as we feel more warmly towards our people and more coldly towards the other side, we begin to slip into tribalism. And so look at this number. This is a survey that was done by a different group, PRRI, which is also they specifically study religion and American life. The left-hand column, I approve of Donald Trump and nothing he could do could lose my approval. These are you could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I would still support him. That's it, 37%. But on the Democratic side, I disapprove of Donald Trump and nothing he could do to win my support. 3/4 of Democrats who disapprove of the president, disapprove 3/4 and say there's nothing he could do to change my mind. Stop building the wall, let in immigrants, raise taxes, rejoin the Paris Treaty. I don't care. He's bad. I can't support him. That is where you get into the idea of tribalism. Now, the one point I wanted to make is it makes it look like Democrats are more tribalistic than Republicans, and I want to say they're about the same because objective reality does factor in here, right? Is he being a good president or isn't he? Is there good solid grounds to being against him or not? And a good control for that are independents, because independents don't belong to a tribe. They're not Democrat or Republican. So if any group is looking more objectively than any other group, it's the independents. And there's lots of surveys that show independents behave differently than Democrats or Republicans. Democrats and Republicans have a dog in the fight. Independents don't. So independents are kind of an indicator of, is Trump a bad president? And so 50% say he is a bad president. I approve of him, but he could lose my support. But the other 37, let's see, how do I say this here? Oh, independent, I'm looking at the wrong number. 7% of the independents say there's nothing he could do to lose my support. But 45% of independents say there's nothing he could do to win my support. So that's kind of an objective indicator that even if you're not a partisan, you probably aren't going to be able to conceive of a way to support Trump as opposed to the group that does. And so when you subtract those two from each other, that's where I was going. About 30% more Republicans support Trump unequivocally than independents, and about 32% of Democrats oppose Trump over independents. So that's my way of saying that this tribalism is roughly evenly matched in both parties, and it's about a third of the voters. It's about a third of each group. So try this one. So one of the things we know about people is they have deeply held beliefs, and when you present them with information that makes them feel uncomfortable about those beliefs, that isn't as deeply held, they change or find a way to challenge the thing they don't hold as deeply, right? So if I really liked Jimmy Carter as president and Republicans said really bad things about Jimmy Carter, I would find ways to say, well, those Republicans, they don't count. They're not really there. They're just out to get him. And so we call it cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance makes you discount information that contradicts what you most fundamentally believe and commit to. And what I want you to see is white evangelical Protestants. White evangelical Protestants in 2011 were asked, can an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life? Less than a third of less than a third of white evangelical Protestants could say yes to that question. Fast forward to 2016. Now Donald Trump is the face of the Republican Party. He's running for president. These are the people who most support him. What is the most important thing to them? Is it their beliefs that if you're immoral in your personal life, you can't be ethical in your public life? Or is it we really want Donald Trump? And clearly, they really want Donald Trump. That's the tribalism thing. They're throwing away their commitment to the belief that an immoral person can't behave ethically. You'll notice in 2011, white evangelical Protestants were the least likely to think you could behave ethically in office if you were immoral. Why? They were thinking of Bill Clinton, right? That's who they were thinking of. In 2016, they are most likely to say you can be ethical and yet immoral in your personal life. They're thinking of Donald Trump. And so they throw out their ethical, moral concerns because their commitment is to the tribe, to the party, to the candidate who's going to bring us conservative judges and tax cuts and all the other things that conservatives and Republicans want. So what that's showing us is the presence of tribalism in the sense that we know what the most important thing is to us and we throw everything else out if it tries to contradict us or tell us what we really are committed to is wrong. Now you'll also notice that everybody else becomes more accepting of immoral behavior, except people who are religiously unaffiliated and are agnostics or atheists, and they actually are demanding more morality from their candidates, and probably they're reacting to Trump there too. So it's not like the white evangelical Protestants are operating in a vacuum. As a society, we're becoming more sort of that relativistic in terms of private versus public, but it's the white evangelicals who are leading the way and are throwing aside their long-term commitment to the idea that who you are as a person is more important than what you do in government. And now they're saying, no, what you do in government is more important. So that's affective polarization. So the last thing I want to talk about is why is that increasing? Is it just what's happening in the real world, or is there something else going on? And that's where we get to group polarization. Now, I have to be honest, I hadn't even heard of group polarization until 2 months ago when I started studying more deeply into this. But group polarization is something that will resonate with you when I explain it to you. It's the idea that when you're in with people like yourself, you tend to take on the values of the group. You tend to want to be like the people in the group. And in fact, you tend to become more intense and more extreme in your views. And so there are studies done in different contexts, political, economic, legal, in different countries around the world, and the same pattern shows. When you are in with people like you become more, you need more and more to be like everybody else. Why is that? Well, part of it is if you're already in the group and the group is sharing information, they're only sharing information they like. And so you're being bombarded with information that supports your pre-existing views. Secondly, you want to conform. You want to be a part of the group. Nobody wants to stand out like a sore thumb in a group. Studies have been done, for instance, show when Lyndon Johnson was making Vietnam policy, whenever somebody got up in his face and said this is a bad idea, they were thrown out of the group. They didn't get to weigh in on Vietnam policy anymore. And you see Donald Trump doing the same thing. When people tell him to do stuff he doesn't want to do, he gets rid of them. He's gone through 4 national security advisors and 3 economic advisors, 3 chiefs of staff, and the turmoil is just enormous because people are telling him things he doesn't want to hear. Well, for most of us, we give in to that pressure and we agree with the group because we don't want to be thrown out. And then the last idea is we become more confident in our views. When everybody's telling us we're right and all the information says we're right, we begin to be more firmly rooted in the idea that we're right. And that leads us to be more extreme in our views. Well, how does that play into the last 20 years? Basically, we can talk about this a lot of ways, but one way to talk about it is echo chambers. Echo chamber is the idea that when you speak, all you hear back is echoes of what you said. Right? And so American politics is becoming a bunch of echo chambers, or you could call it bubbles. There's all different ways it gets talked about. Contributing to echo chambers is what we call niche journalism. Back in the 50s and 60s, if you wanted to be a news provider, you had to have machinery that broadcast news over the airwaves. You owned newspaper chains that reported across the country, and you needed to appeal to a large audience. You had to have a huge audience to make a profit. With the rise of cable TV, but especially the internet, now anybody can produce quote unquote news with very little cost. If you know a little bit of programming, you can buy a web address, you can start being a news source. And so niche journalism kicks in, and we see lots and lots of news sources. And people respond to that. You and I respond to that by creating what we call news silos. So this graph, this is from 2014. This is some more of the stuff when I first started in here. And this is, which news source do you most trust? And if less than 50% of the people trust that news source, it's not on the list. And what's important to see is that conservatives don't trust any news source that liberals or moderates trust. And liberals and moderates don't trust any news source that conservatives trust. And we could go into that in more detail and why and so forth, but I don't want to get into evaluating this. I simply want to say, when you're talking about creating two different worldviews, I'll throw out one thing. I boggle my class's mind with this. Gallup does a poll more than once a year, that they ask people, what are the most important problems facing the country today? Just what's the most important problem? Crime, taxes, whatever. 2019, for the very first time, Democrats and Republicans didn't agree on any of the top 5 serious problems. Republicans were all about immigration, and I don't remember what else, and Democrats were all about health care and the environment. And they just were talking past each other, right? We're in our own little silos. The news is telling us what to pay attention to. They're telling us how to think about it. And we talk back and forth to each other in that way. And so we are out of touch with anybody else. And then, of course, social media contributes to this. Social media, you can pick your friends on Facebook. And liberals are famous for unfriending people they don't agree with. How about that? Conservatives don't do that, but they start with people who are already their friends, right? Conservatives don't have as diverse a group of people in their friends category on Facebook as Democrats, but Democrats reduce the diversity by kicking out the conservatives that they don't like. And so, social media is just another way to do that. And so the point here is that the stronger the sense of the outgroup being out there and a threat to us, a threat to the nation's well-being, the greater the effect of the in-group, right? We really have to stand together on this. And so group polarization is a dynamic that operates in societies around the world and over time that reinforce whatever ideological and affective polarization is out there. And so that's why I think we're seeing these increases today. Well, maybe you wonder, well, is it really that bad? Well, you probably think, my gosh, this is terrible. But what I want to show you is that, in fact, if we look at history, this has happened before. We've had these kinds of things before. Now, the problem with affective polarization, that we don't have polls, right? Polls start in the 50s or 60s. Pew started in 90. But one thing we do have is voting by members of Congress, and that's a good way to get a handle on ideological polarization. Do members of Congress group themselves into these left and right, or do they blend in the middle? And what I want to point out to you is that, for me, the Congress that I grew up with and thought of as being the norm was that little block in the middle, which is atypical for the rest of our history. The Roosevelt Revolution, the Roosevelt presidency, ushered in a government where Southern Democrats, who are incredibly conservative, are now in the majority. They're in the minority out here, so it didn't matter, but they're in the majority and being asked to vote for liberal things. And Northern Democrats are all about that. That's what they want. So this scale, down at the bottom is liberal, up at the top is conservative. The positive number is conservative, the negative number is liberal. And you can see that Southern Democrats are becoming more and more conservative as they're asked to vote on civil rights, the Great Society, those kinds of things. Republicans have moved down a little bit. You've got Northern Democrats, Northern Republicans rather, like Nelson Rockefeller, who think a lot of the Great Society programs were good. They supported them. Indeed, it was Northern Democrats, it was Northern Republicans who enabled us to pass the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65. Southern Democrats weren't letting those happen, and Johnson got Northern Republicans to cross the line. If you're from Illinois, you can give a shout out to Senator Dirksen, because he was the one who really sort of corralled Republican support and made those bills become law. But what we see happening then is Southern Democrats say, hey, you've betrayed us. You've now taken a position on civil rights that we don't like, and you haven't done that in the past, so we're leaving. And so beginning in the 1980s and 90s, you see Southern white Democrats leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. They're unleashed from the controls that they have based on party to vote like a Democrat. Now they're free to vote conservative, and so you see the Republican number starts going up. As these white Southern Democrats leave, the only Southern Democrats who are left are African American or urban Southern Democrats, and they're a lot like Northern Democrats. And so you see those lines all converge. So way at the end over there, 2016, you see that distance between the parties. This is the median member of the Republican Party, the median member of the Democratic Party. And you can see, well, they were pretty far apart in the 1800s. We're pretty far apart today. So we've lived with it in the past. And in fact, what we think of as normal was really, at least what I think of as normal growing up when I went to grad school and stuff, was actually a fleeting, atypical episode in our history. And so normally ideological polarization happens in the United States. So maybe we shouldn't be so worried about it as we are. What about affective polarization? This is more conjectural. You can decide for yourself what you think of as being correct or incorrect. And I'm running out. Okay. So what I did is I went back and looked at history a little bit. I really recommend John Meacham's book, The Soul of America, or Richard Hofstadter's article and book called The Paranoid Style of American Politics. But what you see are periods of time in our history where affective polarization kicks in. After the Civil War, people talked about waving the bloody shirt. Literally, the people who died in the war, they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be rewarded for their sacrifice. The Lost Cause was a Southern response trying to cleanse the Civil War of slavery, and that it was all about states' rights and the noble Confederacy that was defending states' rights, and all those monuments get built right around that time. So that was a time where I think we probably had pretty affective polarization. After World War II, this is a little before my time, but McCarthyism really divided the country. True McCarthy believers thought there was a communist under every bed, and the communists had taken over the State Department, and they gave up China, and all of that sort of stuff. So yes, we have had affective polarization in the past, and we know group polarization happens all the time. But what I really want to focus on is affective polarization. Why is it so ingrained in us? And I apologize because I'm running out of time. So there are scientific arguments about why we affectively polarize, and I think they're true and correct and a good way to understand things. There are parts of our brain that stimulate fear when we encounter things that are different. There are parts of our brain that generate good feelings and trust when we encounter things that are similar. Studies have been done by a good friend of mine at University of Nebraska, and he shows that if you show people a disgusting picture, the people who respond strongly are conservatives. The people who don't respond strongly are liberals. That is, conservatives tend to be more motivated by their fear thing. Liberals tend to be more motivated by their trust. And you can argue about that and go read the studies if you like. But the point is, in your brain, there are pieces that tell you to trust or fear people based on built-in kinds of things. And of course, sociology builds on that, culture builds on that. If you're going to be sleeping in a cave, you better know that the people you're sleeping with aren't going to get up in the night and stab you to death. So you need norms and traditions and values to tell you who's a family member, who's like you, who's different, who's a threat. And so, these are true things. So but what I want to suggest is an additional perspective, insight that can come if we think of it. What do we know about this? What does a Christian perspective tell us about this, a biblical perspective? And it is based on the idea that the Bible tells us God gets to decide what's good and evil. And if you're a fan of Star Trek, you know that there are multiple episodes of Star Trek aimed at saying, no, that's not right. That there is a quote-unquote God in this world who is telling good and evil, but really when Captain Kirk gets into it, he proves that that's really not true, okay? So this is something that you see happening a lot, but what I want to say is what the Bible tells us is that God tells us what's good and what's evil. And in the Old Testament, that God tells us who is us and who is them, right? And God chooses Israel as the us. You're with me, right? Abraham gets it reckoned to him as righteousness, and God is always telling the Israelites, sit back, I will deliver them into your hand. They're the bad guys, I will deliver them into your hand. You can kill them and destroy them. Take over the land, Canaan, Jericho, Gideon, the Midianites. Even when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt, God said, watch what I do, just be silent. Just be silent. I'm going to do it. They're them, they're the them, we're the us, I'll take care of it. God is in charge. In the New Testament, Jesus is teaching us the same thing. He defines moral order and he says, I choose sinners. My us is sinners. Even while you were sinners, you know, he forgives us. He sacrifices himself for us, and so he picks us, people who are sinners, to be part of the us. And the way you get in is you repent and accept Christ. So that's what the Bible tells us. There are us and them, but God's in charge of it. And that's the problem. We don't want God to be in charge of it. We want to be in charge of it. We want to define what's good and evil. We want to judge who's good and evil, and we want to enforce our views of good and evil on people who aren't like us, right? And the cool thing is, we us's are always the good. Nobody ever says, oh, us, we're bad, and them, they're the good ones. We never say that. We're the good, they're the bad. We want the power to do that. When God does it, we get thrown into the bad oftentimes, into the us, into the them rather. We get thrown into the them. And God chooses us out of that, or Christ chooses us out of that. But that doesn't feel good. I don't want to be the them, the bad, If we're in charge of defining good and evil, we get to put ourselves in the good side, the us. And we put those we fear or don't like or envy into the other, the them, the evil group. And so what I want to suggest is one way, this is not like complete, but one way, one facet of thinking about original sin, which is the idea that Adam and Eve chose against God when they ate from the fruit in the Garden of Eden, was it was the fruit of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil. And so, yeah, you know, they want to be like God, but in what sense do they want to be like God? They want to be able to decide good and evil. And so, right from the beginning, in the biblical story, the Christians, you know, base their moral order on, we're condemned to sinner. We're sinners. We're born sinners because we want this power to decide what's good and evil and who's good and who's evil. And there we go. So now, in my overtime here, what do we do about it if we're Christians? You know, if you're not a Christian, you can come to some of these same answers with different premises, of course, right? I'm not saying this is the only way to get to these conclusions, but I am saying that Christianity is a way to get to these conclusions. And so how should we respond when we encounter or when we are tempted to participate in polarization, affective polarization? What does our faith, at least for me, what does my faith say I should do? How should I behave? Now, the one thing I'm not going to talk about is to what ends should I behave? That's a whole other question, and I think it's a great question, but I'm already out of time, and I didn't prepare that, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about how. What is the manner of your behavior when you encounter people like us or them? Or you're tempted to polarize the them? How should you respond? And so I come up with 4 ideas. One is you should be humble, okay? And you can find, you know, I made long lists of Bible verses that tell us to be humble. You know, Micah, walk humbly with your God. And, you know, there's just a whole host of them. Jesus says, don't claim the best place, claim the least place. Be the least. You know, and in other passages we hear, think better of others than yourself. Well, do you really think he meant think better of the other Christians you admire is better than yourself? That's too easy. He has to be talking about people for whom that's a difficult thing to do. And I don't think he really is telling us, well, I know he's not telling us, because that's the next point, to give them what they want. But he is telling you how to think about them. They are the image of God. They are worthy of your respect. Love your neighbor as yourself, all that kind of stuff. So be humble in regards to yourself. Be assertive in regards to others. The Bible, Old Testament and New, is really clear about where God stands on a lot of social issues, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to pick up on. But you know, Jim Wallace, former speaker here, says there's over 2,000 Bible verses that talk about God siding with the poor against the economic oppression. And so when you are speaking out for others, you need to do that. In Proverbs, King Lemuel's mother tells him, open your mouth in defense of the poor, in defense of the weak, right? He's incidentally there, that's the government. The government's supposed to do that, which is useful to think about when you think about what we should be doing. But be assertive. Don't back down, don't roll over, stand up to them, and stand up to us when us are wrong, right? People in your us group are wrong, stand up to them. So be humble. You know, to me, another way of thinking about that is what got pounded into me in grad school, and I know some of you are going to have the same experience if you've got your PhDs and so on, and that is the scientific method. Right? What does the scientific method basically teach you is expect somebody to prove that you were wrong, right? You think you did a test and you've shown that there's a relationship here. Well, the whole point of the scientific method is somebody else comes along and tests it and does an additional data set or introduces a nuance or a variable you didn't think of, and lo and behold, what you learned was incorrect. And so intellectual humility comes part and parcel with academics, at least in my mind. And so be humble, but be assertive. And those are definitely in tension. Definitely in tension. The more assertive you get, the harder it is to be humble. The third idea is have empathy for them you see, for those you see as them. And I think this is the hardest one. Like I said, it's easy to have empathy for the poor. It's easy to have empathy for those who are down on their luck and so on. But what about the people you think are responsible for doing that? What about the people you think are the ones who put them there? So one way to approach that is let's build a wall and just lob righteousness grenades over the wall at the other guy. You know, just blow them up with our righteousness. That has appeal. It creates camaraderie. I never was in the military, but people who are in the military, especially those who serve in combat, tell you, you get really, really close to the people in combat because you're depending on each other to protect you. And so let's get into that foxhole and throw grenades at the bad guys and hope they don't throw grenades that get us. And where's the empathy? Every government, when they go to war, teach their people to dehumanize the other country. Americans were shown pictures of the Japanese that showed that they were monkeys, right? We can kill them, they're just monkeys. We were shown pictures of the German army as these stern monsters with babies hoisted up on their bayonets. They're so evil, we can kill them, right? Well, in a wartime, I get it. You don't want to empathize with the enemy. But it happens, it happens. You've ever heard of the story, the Christmas Eve story on World War I, where the French or the British and the Germans were sitting there waiting to kill each other, and somebody started singing a Christmas hymn. I forget which one it was. And then both sides started singing it. And then they started coming out and talking to each other and giving each other gifts. I'll give you chocolate, you give me tobacco, we'll play soccer together. And then when they were done, they went back to their sides and shot at each other again. But the point is, for a period of time, their faith gave them empathy even with their enemy. And so I think that's what we're called to do, is to, Tim Keller, if you've ever read Tim Keller or heard him speak, he is very disarming of his opponents because he mostly wants to understand them. Tell me why you feel the way you do. You know, he doesn't tell them you're wrong, do it my way. He says, tell me why you think that way. And he wants to get them to share with him so he can empathize with their point of view, not rolling over, but nonetheless giving them the stature that comes with having someone who cares about you and wants to know what you think. And then the last idea is to embrace faithfulness over effectiveness, to do what is right rather than what works. And so this is where, to me, sort of the dark side of Constantine becoming a Christian manifests itself. Because from the time Constantine became Christian to today, pretty much, the Western world has gotten more and more Christianized, right? And so embedded into our political and cultural beliefs and values and hierarchies and who's good and who's bad is this Christian ethos. And yet, there were Christians before Constantine. They were on the margins. They were looked down on. They were spit upon. They were crucified. They were burned at the stake. They were thrown to the lions. But they were faithful, right? But once we become a Christianized country, we are tempted by the power we get with that. What is the power that comes with being the government, being the values that organize and structure our country? And how do we respond when somebody challenges that? What happens when somebody says you don't deserve that power? You don't deserve your values to be first and foremost. We fall back on doing whatever's effective to hold on to it. Give money to candidates. And so what I'm going to end with here is an editorial written by Mark Galli, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. It's a pretty, on the scale of Christianity, it's a pretty conservative magazine, but it's in the middle. And he is talking about his reaction to the election in Alabama, where the Christians, the evangelical Christians, sided with Roy Moore over the Democrat, Doug Jones. And this is before the election happens. And so he said, even though we don't know what's happened yet, the Christian leaders who have excused, ignored, or justified Moore's unscrupulous behavior and indecent rhetoric have given credence to the critics who accuse them of hypocrisy. He says it cuts both ways. Democrats, liberal Christians, democratic Christians, they do the same thing. Yes, I completely agree. But then he gets into why this is a problem. When Christians immerse themselves in politics as Christians, this is what I really want you to think about. For what they determine are Christian causes, touting their version of biblical morality in the public square, they will sooner or later begin to compromise the very principles they champion and do so to such a degree that it blemishes the faith that they are most anxious to promote. And so the desire to keep that power, we've group polarized, and now they are demonized over there. So whatever we do to keep them down and out of power is justified. The means justify the end. You know, God, if we give up on Roy Moore, we can't elect a Republican. This is terrible. So let's take him, right? And let's excuse what he's doing. Let's figure a way out of it. Let's call Donald Trump King Cyrus. They sell these gold coins now on the web with Donald Trump and King Cyrus on one side, trying to create this idea that it's okay to support Trump because Cyrus was terrible, but he helped the Israelites, so that makes Trump okay. And what Galli is saying is, no, put your faithfulness to your values first. In the Old Testament, God was teaching that. Why did he tell Gideon to get rid of his army? He had 30,000 men. They were going to wipe out the Midianites. No, don't do that. He got it down to 300 men. Now go fight them. I'll deliver them into your hand. Don't depend on your own strength. Depend on me. Imagine you're Joshua and you're getting ready to conquer Jericho, and God says, oh, yeah, about that? Grab some trumpets and start marching around the city, and I will deliver them into your hand. I'll make the walls fall down, and then you can go kill them. That's not how we do war. That's not what works. But God was calling us not to do what works. He was calling us to be faithful. And so these are the four things that I hope, shape my reaction to the thems in my life. The thems that aren't in my life but I dislike anyway. Not that I agree with them, not that I give up and don't fight against them, but that I behave in a manner that I think is more reflective of God being the one who chooses the us and the them, God being the one who creates the good and the evil. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Covington. I'm not sure what to call you in this official candidate.
Just call me Carrie.
Carrie, yes. A lot to think of, both from the political science perspective that helps us understand our situation and reflecting on how to address it. It is open to your questions or comments. We all learn together from what we share with each other as well. Anybody that'd like to start us off in that regard? I'll repeat the question so it gets on the video as well. Yes. Here? Yep.
Professor, if the United States had a viable third or fourth party, or we got rid of single-member districts, would that change this, or would then we just have 3 tribes or 4 tribes instead of 2?
Try it again. Oh, you're talking about elections.
Question to look at whether to have a third party or even a Christian party, whether that would be a viable option.
It totally depends on what you replace it with, right? That's what it depends on. It depends on the laws the state adopts. New York, for instance, has made it nearly impossible for third-party candidates to even get on the ballot. So even if you had at-large elections, Congress has passed a law saying you can't have at-large elections. So that's a pretty in-the-weeds question, and I recognize you're a student of mine, so I can understand where that question's coming from. But I would just say I don't know. But generally speaking, yeah, if you remember Duverger's law says when you have single-member plurality districts, you only get 2 parties. And when you get rid of single-member plurality district systems, then the parties multiply. So the countries that don't have single-member districts have 3 or 4 or 5 parties, and those that do have 2.
Can you explain what a single-member district is?
Yes, that's how we do it. We draw lines on a map and say when you live inside this boundary, you vote for this member, and when you live on that side, you vote for a different member. So at the state level, we get to vote for Iowa senators, but Illinois get to vote for Illinois senators. If you're living in Johnson County, you get to vote in the 2nd district for the candidates for Congress. If you live in Dubuque, you live in the 1st district, you get to vote for the candidates in the 1st district. And no matter how many people vote Democratic in the 1st district, in the 2nd district, the people make up their own mind and they could vote Republican. And maybe the Republican in the 2nd district wins by 10 votes and the Democrat in the 1st district wins by 1,000 votes. And there's 990 more Democratic votes cast, but they're 1 and 1. So that's the single-member plurality district.
So do you think that third parties are not viable?
Not in the United States. Third-party presidential candidates, and I use third-party loosely because they're not really parties, but candidates outside the 2 major parties have and run and been successful in winning votes. But even an incumbent president who ran for re-election on a third-party ticket couldn't win. That was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. He had been the Democratic nominee. He thought that it happened in 1960, get my dates right. Anyway, he was unhappy with the Republican candidate, and so he said, nominate me again. They didn't, so he ran as a third-party candidate, and he beat the Republican candidate, Taft, but he lost to the Democrats, so we got Woodrow Wilson. And so the idea of overcoming both party candidates is just impossible. Think baseball. If you've got 5 teams above you to get to the championship, it's really hard because it's hard. They're winning games. And if there's just 1 team ahead of you, it's much easier to reel them in.
Okay. Yes, over here. Arnie?
It seems one of the goals of Korea and Russia has been to stir polarization. Separate from the information you've given us, is there any information that they have been part of this polarization?
Question or comment being raised is whether outside influences such as Russia or Korea, North Korea, I hope not South, but maybe, who knows. But is that stoking of polarization?
His example was North Korea and Russia.
Yes, right.
Right, so the answer is affective and group polarization does not stop at the shoreline. And Russians are subject to affective polarization, and North Koreans are. And what really matters is that we are, and therefore when we hear information that reinforces our affective polarization against the other group, we buy it. right? And so the problem is that if Russia or North Korea or Ukraine or any other country fed information into our political system that was clearly wrong, there are certain groups of people who will embrace it and say yes, because it allows them to say we're good and they're bad. And even if it's false, they don't care about that as much. Now, if it makes them look bad, then they're all over how false it is, right? But if it reinforces it, you have a much lower threshold to cross to buy into the information.
So what percentage do you think might they have contributed to polarization? Like 1?
Oh, nobody can begin to say. First you have to know, we don't even know exactly how many people were exposed to fake information. We don't really have those numbers. We don't know how it affected them. So I have no idea. And somebody will probably write a dissertation on it in 20 years and they'll have an idea, but I don't know.
Okay. This is right here in the middle.
Is the Christian ideology of faithfulness, do you need a political party to realize that ideology? Or is there a way that we can practice that apart from the party system altogether? So in Acts, you see these Christians having these moments of like one accordness, despite being under Roman rule and not really having access to the party at all.
Can't do that.
But they're having this ideology of faithfulness. Is that possible now?
Question of whether Christian faithfulness can function in a way that gets beyond the party boundaries. Fair enough summary?
Yeah, can we realize that without getting involved? Or do we need the platform?
So thank you, Brendan, and I really appreciate Tom's up here to repeat the questions, because I am totally deaf in this ear, and I really don't hear very well in this ear, so I don't hear what you guys are saying. So I am answering his question, not yours, okay? So if you're mad at my answer, Andy,
blame me.
I don't know. I'm very hesitant to think that we should have a Christian party. I mean, I told you there were 2 questions to ask about how we should respond in a political environment. One was the manner of our reaction, and the other is the subject or the target of our reaction. What are we aiming at? And I didn't want to today go into what should we as Christians be saying is good and bad that we can agree and fight for all together. One, because I know that that list doesn't exist. But 2, it's buying into the whole Christendom triumphant idea that we get to impose our views on other people. And I don't think of Christ ever telling us, hey, go out there and hold knives to the throats of anybody until they accept me as their savior, right? And by the same token, he's not saying force them to vote the right way. And so I just think faith intersects with politics differently than the way we think about it. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the moral majority really changed the way Christians think about intersecting with government. When Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and those guys, it was to get off the sidelines. One of the criticisms made of pietistic Christianity for years was, well, they don't care about what goes on outside, they just care about their faith and bringing others to faith. And liberal Christians were saying, shouldn't we also try to redeem the world? And you get all those arguments. But I think if you're asking how do Christians organize themselves as Christians to get into politics, I think that is the wrong question. And maybe that wasn't the question. Okay.
Just a slight follow-up, maybe that would help. And that is, you said, the moral majority kind of said, okay, let's get in here and try to win the elections, put our people in power. That has had different results. And one reaction that some Christians have also had now are saying, let's just pull out the Benedictine option. Let's just pull away from it. Let's not get involved in this mess.
So
comments on those, or a better way, a third way?
So you noticed all the churches that support Tom's ministry are Presbyterian churches. That means they're all Reformed churches. That means they all follow the teachings of Calvin. And so Calvin says the whole world is God's world. We should try to redeem the whole world. And so you don't withdraw to, from. And who's the political leader, the Dutch political leader?
Abraham Kuyper, probably.
Kuyper, yes, Kuyper. I haven't been in the Christian Reformed Church in a long time, so I forgot. But Abraham Kuyper was very much of that mindset. So you don't withdraw, but you play by the rules that are faithful to what you've been taught in your faith, not according to the rules of the world that say this is how you win. You don't go to Karl Rove or James, can't think of the guy on the Democratic side, and ask them what's the best way for Christians to win. That's just getting off on the wrong foot.
Okay. In the back middle here?
Yes. We've been talking about the United States context. For 3 years, I dated a Shiite who grew up during the Lebanese Civil War, and she did not let go of the mindset that Christianity and Shiitism were more tribes than religions. I'm not sure my question is, what do we do about places like 1980s Lebanon, or 2000s Iraq, or Northern Ireland, where things have degenerated so much that a religion is not really a religion anymore. It's just a marker of what tribe you belong to.
The common question saying in other places of the world, such as Lebanon and some Shia-Sunni conflicts, Northern Ireland conflicts, where religion becomes more politics than religion, do you see that danger here, maybe, and how can that be addressed?
Yeah. So, in some societies, their religion is their cultural identity as well as their religion. And more importantly, the others in that society view them as that identity rather than as Christians, right? So if the Irish Protestants and the Irish Catholics tried to talk together as Christians, that would be very different than if it was acting on their political identities first and putting their faith second. That would be, it should be hard to call people to destroy the image of God. It should be really hard. There are times it's appropriate. I totally get it. We need police, we need armies, but it should be hard. And when we stop thinking of the other as being in the image of God, it gets easier. And the thing that's a particular slap in the face to us when we do that is that Jesus, when he said, when we were yet sinners, he gave his life for us. We were the ultimate us, and yet he drew us in at the price of his own human life, right? And with that role model out there, how dare we embrace our political identities more than our faith identities? That's how does that address what you were asking about?
I'm not sure my question was. Is there a difference between the United States and some of these other places?
Oh, sure there are, yeah. But I would say from the numbers I showed you that we're not more than 40, 50 years behind some of these places. For example, let me give you a good example. Democrats used to get up on a high horse after 2010 and go, oh, look at those Republicans. They've got the Tea Party movement and they're radicalizing the Republican Party, and look how unwilling to work with us and how rigid they are and blah, 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 how closed-minded they are. And we're liberal Democrats and we're willing to compromise and so on. And then, you start to get the Justice Democrats showing up on the right? Alexandra Ocasio. On
the right or left?
Pardon?
Right or left?
Left, very left.
Right, you said the right, so.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. And what did she do? She took out a perfectly fine liberal Democrat. He just wasn't liberal enough for her. And now she's organizing other liberal Democrats to kick out good liberal Democrats because they want great. They want extreme liberal Democrats. And so as the Justice Democrats take over the Democratic Party and the Tea Party Republicans take over the Republican Party, you're going to start to get the kind of situation you're describing, because there's no place between us for us to have a conversation. We have to win. We have to beat the other side. That is the commitment of the Tea Party movement. That is the commitment of the Justice Democrats. Take a step back. The wisdom of American politics has always, always, always been a half a loaf is better than no loaf. Take a compromise, get part of what you want, come back, play the game again. And we're moving into a place where half a loaf is a betrayal of your principles. I've got so many graphs I could show you, but Gallup did a survey of Democrats and Republicans, and they looked at moderate Republicans, sort of regular conservative Republicans, and extremely conservative Republicans. And the plurality of extremely conservative Republicans, that is the people who vote in Republican primaries, 41% of all Republicans said it's better to stand on principle and lose than to compromise. And right from the days of our founder right up through today, more or less, we've always thought it was good to give the other guys some of what they want, get some of what we want. We remind ourselves that we're in this together, and then we go on to the next dispute. And what American politics is becoming is, it's my way or the highway. I get what I want, or you get what you want, but I'm not giving an inch. And you see that creeping in on the left now in a way that 10 years ago we saw it creep in on the right. And so everybody's susceptible to this. That's the point. This isn't an ideological thing, this is a human thing. And that's why I said if we approach it as Christians, we get an insight on it. But you're right, there are places in the world where they've gone so far into identity that they've lost sight of the religious faith that they share in common. And so.
Okay, another? Yes, Maria.
How do voters and other citizens encourage respectful dialogue from politicians?
Excuse me.
Decent language, less demeaning, social media in any way, so that there can be conversation and kind of bring back political, exchanges, rather than just phrases or throwing out false news, whatever, so that whoever shouts the loudest is heard.
Basically, how can we be agents of civil dialogue in the midst of all the echo chambers where it can easily be discounted? How can we do that as voters? How can we do that as people?
Right. So just so you understand, this is a question that consumes a lot of people. There's a institute at the university called the Public Policy Institute, and that has been a theme of theirs for many years. They bring in speakers and have workshops about that topic, right? And so a lot of people are worried about that. And just as a practical matter, I think there's a couple of things. Like I said, I think Tim Keller's approach is excellent. Get them to tell you more. Why do you think I'm an idiot? Why do you think I'm going to hell? Oh, that's interesting. And validate that they are entitled to their opinion, and then ask if they want to hear your opinion. If they don't, they don't. I mean, you've all seen, I put this on my Facebook post one time, a circle graph, and it was, green are the people who had their minds changed through a Facebook conversation. Blue was the people who became undecided, and red were the people who didn't change their mind. And it was a red rubber ball, right? It was just all red. Nobody changes their mind on Facebook. But I know what I do. What I do is I don't send my Facebook posts. I write them, and then I look at them. And then I go, my gosh, I didn't really mean to say that. I mean, part of the problem with social media and comments is it's word on paper, it's not voice. You don't hear inflection, you don't see the face. And so you often worry, I meant that one way, and are they taking it another way? And so time is your best friend. I've got a post to a friend of mine who is a colleague here at Iowa, and he is very, very liberal, and I share a lot of his values. But he posted a meme that said, if your religion tells you not to have an abortion, don't have an abortion. But your religion can't tell me that I can't have an abortion. And I'm writing a response to that, which is to say, so you're telling me Martin Luther King should have shut up and not told people to respect the civil rights of African Americans? Are you telling me that labor leaders at this turn of the century who were Christians should have shut up and not told monopolists to stop hiring 10-year-old children or making people work 60-hour work weeks? Be careful what you say, because when you apply it to someone just because you don't like the content of what they're supporting, it can have ramifications way beyond that. And so how do I say that without making him defensive? How do I say that without, and so it's sitting on my computer. And eventually I will send it to him, but for now, it's percolating. Besides, this talk took priority. I had to set it aside. I couldn't think about it.
Okay, one more. If
Lorraine,
there
did you have
is.
a question? I saw Lorraine's hand. Did it get answered?
I identify with that graph you showed at the beginning with the three humps and then the separation, but I feel really pulled because in many ways I sort of identify with more in the middle. I find that there are things on both ends that I strongly agree with and I strongly disagree with.
Right.
But within this culture and having that two-party system, I found myself sort of politically radicalized in one direction. Not
Right.
because I feel that that party is 100% right. I feel there's certain things that I strongly disagree with and think are wrong.
There used to be a vibrant community of Democrats who were on the pro-life side of abortion. Bob Casey was a governor of Pennsylvania. In 2008, Hillary Clinton said abortion should be legal, safe, and rare. And so that's kind of the middle, right? Those are people who aren't making the left or the right very happy. And what's happening is, if you say that from the left, then you get castigated. And so that was another point. In fact, I skipped over it. I should have mentioned it. So if you think of this as, well, you go out and reach out to the other side, you build a bridge, right, to the other side. What message are you sending to the us? You're telling the us, you're a traitor. And so you're going to get shot in the back. And you're going to lose your friends from the us side. One of my favorite writers is George Orwell. George Orwell was a socialist, but socialists wanted nothing to do with him because he kept telling the socialists all of the hypocritical positions they were taking, and they said, shut up, stop doing that, right? And I read Orwell all through teenage and years, and I really identified with that, right? And so I agree. I don't find a home in either place, you know, and you know, so I totally agree. And the polarization does just make it harder. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody do the work. Maybe it's been done, but I would be interested to see surveys done over, say, the last 20 years of Democrats' positions on abortion and the candidates' positions. Because I think the party is basically filtering out pro-life candidates over time. And that's good for their party, right? That's what they believe, and so that's what they should do. But if you think we should try to prevent abortions from happening, even if you think they should be legal, it gets harder and harder to find your home there. And so I commiserate with you, but I have no, misery loves company. Thank you for sharing.
Just in case others didn't hear it, the issue of, with the growing polarization, that we feel pulled in different ways or pushed to go further one way than the other, even if we don't want to. That raises a lot of tensions. And I think in closing, you've raised the tensions.
Right.
And you've said as your comments of humility, of listening and actually trying to enter into civil dialogue. Any final nugget you'd like to leave us with?
Well, it's just think before you speak.
Think before you speak.
The other person and how they're receiving what you say, and value their reaction. That's it.
Okay, value the other. And yes, think before you speak.
Have I gone quiet?
Remember I think it's gone down in power a little bit there. Remember how it's going to affect the other person, how they're going to react, and care.
So if you
about
push
how
the
they
other
react.
person further away by the way you say something, you're not helping yourself. You have to say something in a way that draws them to you, even though you don't agree, that they want to hear more just as you want to hear more. That is what I would say.
Thank you, Carrie, for leading us in this.